listening to the Comic Book Bears podcast. I'm Billy Z.
And I'm Steve Morey.
And it's just the two of us tonight. We don't have Brian with us. Steve, is Brian at They Might Be Giants tonight, or is that later in the week?
I think that's tonight for some reason, which is pretty freaking awesome, and I'm super jealous.
Yeah. Well, I have seen them 4 times, with the asterisks presenting that 3 of those times were opening for Elvis Costello. So, they're okay.
Jeez.
I go to the first 3 albums and not much after that. So these people who are listening don't care. They want to hear about comics. And we decided with this particular episode, because we are not equipped right now to do an episode about new comics. So for this particular episode, we decided we're going to spotlight something from the past. Now, if you've been following some of the programming that has happened recently on geek-oriented TV, you know that there was a Sci-Fi Wire 5-part documentary series about this publisher, and this publisher story was also the focus of the last episode of Robert Kirkman's Secret History of Comics. The publisher we're talking about is Image Comics, and what we're going to be talking about specifically is early Image, which is its own thing. And it also was so dramatically successful, and Image certainly can lay claim to actually revolutionizing comics to some degree. There was a time period where Image was actually the number 2 publisher over DC. And there were points where Marvel and DC were following Image's lead instead of leading the industry. And we're going to talk about that stuff and talk about some ridiculous comics that came out as a result of that. But I want to bring Steve in with this right now. So, Steve, how old were you in 1992 when the first Image Comics hit?
Well, it was actually perfect timing for me because I was 11 and 12 years old. I was born in 1980, late 1980, so these comics came out at a time that I was knee deep in being a comic reader. I was pretty much brought into comics with X-Men, so I was, totally into the X-Men. I was really into Spider-Man. Mostly a Marvel guy, so I definitely loved the X-Men and all the spin-off books. X-Factor, of course, because it had the original X-Men group that I loved. But right around this time was when, in 1990, 1991, Marvel was going ahead and sort of revamping a lot of their comics. They were a very interesting crop of artists, and of course, Chris Claremont leading the way in the writing. But it was mostly the artists that were kind of starting to drive the look of the X-Men in particular. And also on the Spider-Man side, you had this interesting guy who had this really, really unique way of drawing that was a little bit different from what you had been seeing with other Marvel books at that time. You still had a lot of that. We've talked about this in the past. Sort of like you have the DC house look and the Marvel house look, where you can look at a particular comic and kind of know what time period it was in, and it was very staunchly from Bronze Age, late 70s through late 80s, kind of that particular look for the majority of the big titles. But here's Spider-Man, nondescript Spider-Man with this cartoony, oversized eyes and faces, and if you were a woman, lips and hair, just this interesting look and these beautiful details, especially in the covers, but also on splash pages that burst out of the panels. On the X-Men side, you had Jim Lee, really coming through on the Uncanny X-Men, just sort of really creating these beautiful, I wouldn't really call them life accurate by any stretch of the imagination. The men had muscles upon muscles and the women were just so perfect, but it was a beautiful design for a lot of these X-Men. It really gave a feel to the book. And I think, when did he start really coming in? Was it in the 250s or the 260s for those issues there?
going to have to go, but I think we should just backpedal just a little bit
Yeah.
so that people are aware of the personnel that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Because, again, you have talked about Todd McFarlane.
Yep.
The main impetus for Image forming in the early 90s was that there were a series of Marvel creators, primarily artists or
Mm-hmm.
writer artists. Though
And
that
mostly
can
artists.
mostly artists. As we'll see, that were really helping to move serious units
Mm-hmm.
for a lot of Marvel's flagship titles. You had Rob Liefeld, who had taken over New Mutants and morphed that into the far more successful X-Force. You had Todd McFarlane, after starting at DC with Infinity Inc. and moving over to Marvel with the Incredible Hulk, and again, really shaking up that title and not being bound by what came before in terms of the artistic expression that you would
Mm-hmm.
normally see with the Hulk. Moved over to Spider-Man, and you have amazing depictions of webs and positioning and possibly hairsprayed look for Mary Jane. Like there's a lot of camp to this now, but it is hard to convey how exciting a lot
Mm-hmm.
of that was. So you had these artists. You had Erik Larsen, who took over for Todd McFarlane on the Amazing Spider-Man title
Mm-hmm.
after Todd had really been given his own Spider-Man title, and that number one was, after Legend. I believe the first comic that they said around this time of the very late 80s and the early 90s, though the record keeping was much better after 1990 for a lot of reasons. The first book
Yeah.
that sold incredibly well was Batman's Legends of the Dark Knight number one. And that was one of the first books after Man of Steel where you had a major company who was doing variant covers because they had different color schemes for the four covers for that particular book. And Marvel eventually ran with that, with the
Mm-hmm.
number. So, again, is this tag during this time of the gimmick era. And that's
Yeah.
certainly something that Image picked up, and we'll talk about that later. But I mentioned Erik Larsen, I mentioned Rob Liefeld, as you had
Mm-hmm.
talked about Jim Lee starting on Uncanny X-Men and eventually be sort of kind of given his own X-Men title, where he did
Mm-hmm.
take over the plot with Chris Claremont still providing the scripts for a
Mm-hmm.
very brief time on X-Men, with the number one issue of that. It remains the biggest selling comic of all time.
That number one. Speaking of variant covers and gimmicky covers with the 4-panel fold out, the multiple printings with the different inks. That was, yeah. And with that Spider-Man number one too, I do remember that did have multiple variant covers.
Mm-hmm.
I remember going into my, comic shop, Starship Excalibur, Lincoln, and seeing, obviously behind the counter, but like a couple different versions of that cover, which I thought were kind of cool. Obviously out of the realm of something that I would have wanted at that age. Like, gee, do I need the gold cover version or the black and white? Do I need a different colored version of this issue? But it is a really interesting time, and again, gimmick era really does describe it. This is where, in the 1990, 1991, we're seeing multiple versions of number ones. We're seeing holograms in covers. We're seeing embossed or raised lettering, die cuts.
Polybagged with cards.
Polybagged with
cards, yep.
And polybagged with cards.
Right. So in addition to the creators that I just mentioned, you also had Wilt Portacio, who was also in the X-Men camp. Marc Silvestri, who had preceded Jim Lee on X-Men and then moved over to Wolverine, and that was really where he came to prominence. And you also had, and to me this is the most interesting member of the original Image group, is Jim Valentino, who came very much from an indie background, who came to Marvel and was given the Guardians of the Galaxy book. Not the Guardians that we know at this time, that are prominent right now, but this was the original Future group, but he expanded it, basically giving Marvel a legion of superheroes. And he was on writing and artistic duties for that book. And though the last few names that I mentioned weren't necessarily the heavyweights of the Jim Lee and the Liefeld and the McFarlane names, they still were creators that were contributing to books that were selling very well. And none of these guys really got compensated in relation to the success of the books. Yes, there were royalty payments, and historically DC was a little better in terms of royalty and creative participation. Marvel was a different a different animal. And the company line that it was the characters that were selling and not necessarily the creators.
Mm-hmm.
So in 1992, these creators basically jumped ship, and when they jumped ship, they jumped onto their own ship instead of working for a different imprint at Marvel or going over to DC. And these were really huge names at this point. Do you know, Steve, that there was actually an eighth name associated briefly with the creation of Image?
Well, Chris Claremont, I
You
know,
got
had
it. A lot of
originally
people
thought,
forget about that. Yeah.
yeah. Well, he was the only one who I would say was probably the most prominent in terms of his writing cred.
Yeah.
You know, everybody else had really cut their teeth, or at least got their names. Obviously, they all had experience in writing, but they really got their names in their art and their extremely distinctive art styles. Whereas Claremont was the X-Men.
Mm-hmm.
Through the 80s. I mean, it
and that
was
also really
him
surprised me
straight
because there was so much friction between him and Jim Lee. It was a surprising name when you go back through the history. As we had mentioned, Will Spartacio was one of those names. Unfortunately, at the time, he had a bunch of health issues within his family. So
Yeah.
we looked to those 6 founders, McFarlane, Lee, Liefeld, Silvestri, Larsen, and Valentino, as the founders of Image Comics at the end of 1991, and Image actually starts offering output in 1992 with their first books.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Steve, here's a quiz. In the calendar year of 1992, Image published 8 different titles. Can you name those titles?
Let's see. Obviously Youngblood, Savage Dragon, Spawn, and WildC.A.T.S. So there's 4. I also think that Shadowhawk was one of that because that was Jim Valentino's title. Cyberforce, I know, was one of the first books, but I don't know if it came out in 92.
The first issue came out in 1992.
It did? Okay,
Yep.
so that's 6.
And there are 2 others.
Let's see.
And to give you a hint, they are associated with the same Image creator.
I mean, I would think that they would be Youngblood spin-offs, so maybe Brigade?
Yes, Brigade.
And that's 7, so what's the 8th one? Well, what's another? Let's see. Bloodstrike, was that one of them? Possibly.
Nope.
Nope.
The 8th title that was published in December 1992 was the first issue of Supreme.
Oh, really? Supreme was. That's right. Which I actually have the first 1 or 2 or 3 issues there. Anyway, so it was about this time that Image marketed themselves perfectly. People bought the number 1s. They bought the number 2s. Or at least they tried to buy the number 2s. They didn't always do that successfully. But those number 1s, everybody wanted an issue number 1 of an Image title. Spawn, I think, sold almost 2 million copies. Mm-hmm. Spawn number 1.
Well, Spawn was at 1.7, and WildC.A.T.S was at 1.5.
Yeah,
and those are the first independent comics to sell over 1 million copies.
And if you think about that, what did we know about Spawn? What did we know about WildC.A.T.S or Youngblood or any of these, other than the fact that, hey, they're being drawn by these people who drew X books or Spider-Man? Mm-hmm. It was the names themselves of the creators that sold the books, not necessarily the concepts. Though I'm sure that did have something to do with it. Everybody likes a cool team book where everybody's got interesting powers, or a dark brooding, kind of Spider-Man looking guy who's actually, resurrected from hell. Who knows? I mean, interesting concepts. Savage Dragon, same thing. Although I think with Savage Dragon they started off as a mini-series before they went to the long-running one. But
yeah, and that wasn't uncommon for some others. I mean, Shadowhawk initially was a series of mini-series. Cyberforce started as a miniseries. Brigade was a miniseries. So that wasn't necessarily uncommon in regards to their business plan.
Exactly.
Let me talk a little bit about myself and where I was. So let me put out my calculator because I can't do this offhand. So in 1992, I was definitely out of college and paying rent. And I was 25 years old. All right, I'm saying 24. I was 24 years old. So I had my golden age reading comics in the 70s as a kid, returned in college, just before college, and that was the time where DC was firing on all cylinders in the 80s.
Mhm.
Just a great time to be a DC fan. And when I graduated and things gradually got more difficult to justify expenditures for fun stuff, more likely spend any disposable income I had on CDs or concert tickets. And comics went by the wayside, and I really basically stopped reading comics at the end of 1990. But these books were so well publicized. It wasn't uncommon for me to walk into the Port Authority, getting on a bus to head home. Bus is delayed. I'd walk into the Hallmark store, and there would be comics. Comics were everywhere at this time. Again, we can talk a little bit later about Black September and how there was a serious implosion for the industry a little later in the 90s because of a lot of the problematic aspects of the gimmick era. So I remember getting Youngblood #1. I remember getting Spawn #1. I remember getting Shadowhawk #2. and, Brigade. So I wasn't completely unfamiliar with what was going on, though I wasn't an active participant.
Yeah.
But I can talk about the first issue of Brigade specifically. Because I remember grabbing that book, reading it on the bus. Now, at the time, for me to get from Manhattan to where I lived was maybe 20 minutes, provided you didn't have a lot of traffic on Route 3. I don't know, people don't care about it. It took me about 20 minutes to get home.
Tell me about what exit you're off of on the turnpike.
So I thought, like, hey, I have a comic book, and, this will get me home. I read Brigade #1 in 2 minutes. And, this is something we have to talk about how these books were fashioned. A ridiculous amount of splash pages. Again, these are books that were artist-driven, except I will say I do think Shadowhawk was a bit more writer-driven of the original batch. There's good and bad to that. You get lots of pretty pictures, but sometimes the pretty pictures mean a sacrifice of sensible story.
Yeah.
And a lot of these artists as writers really didn't function as well as what had come before with Marvel, where they did have, even if they were the principal plotter of the books, they had decent augmentation in terms of very good writers with them, like John Byrne and Chris Claremont and Fabian Nicieza.
I mean, you also have an editorial staff where, Image, the whole point was not to be controlled by editorial. These were creators who controlled their own work. And when you're working with an editor, when you have somebody who's keeping you on a timetable, when you have somebody who's got a Bible of stuff that you can just pull from and say, okay, well, I need to do X, Y, Z with this particular character. I can refer to whatever. I don't want to say it's easier, but I want to say it allows for a lot more structure. And purpose for your work. Whereas here are some creators who've got some great ideas, and that's arguable as well. How much are those great ideas 100% or at least 99% influenced by what they were drawing just a couple months previously for their original company. They've got these great ideas, but they don't really know how to structure the narrative in a way to make it a lot more interesting other than splash pages or one big long page of exposition and then fight, splash page, the end. There were two books I think that kind of bucked that trend as well. And with Shadowhawk, I kind of agree with that, but I also, and again, no shade to Valentino, but I thought it was probably the most boring of the original Image books.
I would agree with that. It wasn't exactly an exciting pace to it, but you also had a lead character. This is not a spoiler for people. This has been known for 25 years. A lead character who was HIV positive and eventually died of the AIDS virus. It's comic books. He got better.
But yeah, you had
But I do think Shadowhawk was the book that was the most rooted in reality.
Exactly. But then you had like two, I would say, fantastically written books. Or maybe not fantastic, but written in a way that they were engaging without necessarily relying 100% on the art. Spawn and Savage Dragon.
Yeah.
And I know Savage Dragon isn't a lot of people's cup of tea.
Yeah, and I'm there too. I've never gotten Erik Larsen. I've just
Hmm.
never gotten it. There's a lot of things about him I respect. I respect that he's stayed on this property. He has been Savage Dragon for
Yeah,
25 years. There isn't a
exactly.
single issue that isn't written and drawn by him. Can't even say that about Spawn.
Yeah.
I respect the man tremendously. I've never really enjoyed his artwork, and I've never gotten Savage Dragon. But for me to say it's not my cup of tea, I recognize that it is palatable to many, many people, and there's a lot there to be respected.
Especially when you're looking at 1992, the first steps of Image Comics. I mean, when you're looking at what they're putting out, as a 12-year-old kid, I was so excited. And least of all, and I think we do need to mention this. I actually, it was funny. I was talking about this with the owner of my LCS earlier today when I was in Charlotte, and he mentioned, hey, if you're talking about Image in the 90s, one of the big things that they brought to the table was the quality of the paper stock,
Absolutely.
the digital coloring, just added to the vibrance of these books. So if you saw them on your shelf, if your store could actually keep them on the shelves, they stood out.
Absolutely.
Compared to the newsprint that Marvel and DC were still doing for the majority of their books. I mean, obviously they all had some premium titles that had the Baxter paper, but you had this bright, brilliant cover, and you open it up, and that brilliance, that color, that quality of paper continued on the inside.
Yeah. You could buy any issue of, like, say, the first 5 issues of WildC.A.T.S. today, and they'll look like they just came off the printer.
Exactly.
Really good paper stock, and really, even if it was a gimmick cover, it was very good stock. And it comes with being an artist-driven company. These guys don't want toilet paper.
Yeah.
They want to see their work in a prestige format, not saying the prestige format. And I do think that was something that was one of the good things that Image brought to the industry, one of the very good things, because there wasn't any company, apart from Fly By Nights, everybody's paper stock got better within the next 2 or 3 years.
It's about the presentation. If you're going to be paying at that time, which was $1.95 for a cover price, for just a standard issue of something was high. I mean, that was very high. So you wanted to be able to look at that book and say, well, this is quality. And obviously that was what Image wanted to sell, was quality and innovation in their books. I mean, sure, they couldn't get them out on time, but when they did show up, they were very nice.
To mention, because as you said, they weren't bound by editorial control, and you would have some books that were delayed like 7 months at points.
Oh yeah, sometimes delayed so much that they might as well have been canceled because they never got finished, or the artist on it was just way too busy with too many properties. I mean, I'm looking at Liefeld for one of those as one of the big egregious offenders there, is that he had so many properties that he put out. I think he had within 92 and 93, did he have like, I want to say maybe 7 or 8 different number ones that he was putting out?
Yeah, it could be
with his titles alone. Glory, Prophet,
you
what they
had
93.
Youngblood Strike File.
Oh, Strike Files.
Blood Strike.
Bad Rock, I think, had his own book.
Yeah, Bad Rock eventually. Troll had a one shot. Yeah. Ooh. Let me tell you about my history with Liefeld, because out of all the Image books, I'm most familiar with the Liefeld stuff, and I'll tell you how this happened. Okay. So this is where we're flashing forward, and we'll fill in some information about some of the other stuff. We've been talking about what some of our favorites are. You did have these creators who were flowing with cash at points, so they were able to bring writers over like Chris Claremont and Alan Moore. Alan Moore writing ridiculous titles like Violator. But one thing that Alan Moore did was take over the Supreme title. Supreme was god-awful.
It was bad.
Supreme is the Superman analog for, I don't think they've ever called it an Extreme Verse or whatever. It
was Extreme Studios.
Yeah, Extreme. But it was also awesome, and it was Maximum Press. So for the first 40 issues, I can't believe that the book lasted 40 issues. Supreme was it was god-awful. Superman, but an angry, nasty Superman. Alan Moore comes in with issue 41, the beginning of the Story of the Year arc, and turns this property on its head. And for the next, I want to say 4 years or so, because there were a lot of delays with that book as well, crafts some of the best Superman stories ever. They're just not called Superman.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I got into this stuff. Because, as I said, I had the first few issues of Youngblood. I definitely had Prophet #1. I don't know what appealed to me about that. I don't know, but I definitely had some of his stuff. On an eBay auction for less than $100, I guess somebody got real mad at Rob Liefeld. And I basically had everything that was put out by Image under Liefeld's umbrella, including the Youngblood toys, including the Supreme and Badrock statues. It was a huge box, and I got it for less than $100. So I was like, oh, okay, I've got his universe here. So like I said, a lot of these books you can read in a minute or two. That was a weekend. So out of all the original properties from the Image creators, the Youngblood and adjuncts are the ones that I'm most familiar with. And Youngblood, I think, is an interesting example because most of it's crap. But there were concepts underneath that were interesting and made, I don't want to say ahead of their time, but maybe would have had a lot more resonance later. The idea of superheroes as celebrity and in a connected world where you do have the internet, I think it would have been more interesting, let's say. I also think that since Youngblood has been revived in various versions, they haven't been bad. They've played with the concept. And if I can recommend a particular book that has a tip of the hat to the Imageverse, it's an Alan Moore series called Judgment Day, which he basically has said is his apology for Watchmen, for what Watchmen brought in terms of the realism to comics. In Moore's eyes, he saw the Image books as an extension of that, in a sense. And this was his way of kind of anchoring it back to classic comic book tropes. Basically think of like the Liefeld versus having a Crisis on Infinite Earths. And even there you do have like Larsen characters like Super Patriot. There are some connections to other stuff. The trade is really hard to find, but you can find the single issues for like $1 or $2. So that would be my early Image recommendation. But I do want to talk to you, Steve. I think you had mentioned somewhat with Savage Dragon or Spawn. What would you say was a particular favorite of the early stuff for you?
Well, I definitely love Spawn back in the day. Like right now, I don't think you could pay me to pick up an issue. But back then, that was storytelling that I hadn't seen before. Todd McFarlane has a very dark and twisted mind when it comes to storytelling, and that was something I hadn't really been exposed to up to that point, because here I am reading a lot of the mainstream stuff that Marvel and DC is putting out. This is the comics code. Comics, there were certain things that they couldn't do or couldn't get away with, or if they did try to put them in there, a little bit more subversive stuff, it couldn't be as blatant, or it couldn't be as, dark as they wanted to maybe be. Image books didn't follow. They were independent. So here I was reading books that technically were possibly for more mature readers. I mean, sure, they had the quote-unquote maturity of throwing in buckets of blood as much as you could possibly have, or talking about rape or something like that, which was very taboo at the time.
A lot of ass.
A lot of ass, so much ass. They had to do
both male and female, a lot of ass.
True, but of course, much more female, and their boobs were, astronomical in relation to their waists. But
a big need for chiropractors in the Imageverse.
Oh gosh, yeah. Well, it's okay because they never seem to get older than 23, 24, so they weren't at that point where their backs would hurt them.
And that's one of the most interesting things I think about where some of these properties have gone, because some of them have aged in real time.
Youngblood especially.
Savage Dragon has.
Savage Dragon.
And I do believe those Spawn I don't think is year for year. I do think Al Simmons and the characters around him, like his daughter, have aged somewhat.
Well, they've aged, they've changed. There's been multiple Spawns. Angela Neil Gaiman came in, and this is again why I thought early Spawn was a cut above the rest in terms of storytelling, because Todd McFarlane early on recognized that in order to maintain a consistent product, to put out his book as frequently as people expected it, he couldn't really write and do everything himself. And early on, he brought in other writers, Neil Gaiman, Dave Sims, Alan Moore, to write
Frank
some of
Miller.
those issues. Frank Miller even in the first year and a half of Spawn. And so some of those early issues were just, a way for me as a mainstream comics kid to get introduced to a lot of these independent writers who had been working in the indie space for years and who earlier I wouldn't have been exposed to. I had never heard of Dave Sims except in, like an offhand comment overheard at the comic shop. Because obviously I'm a kid. I wouldn't be reading Cerberus. I wouldn't have even known where to get Cerberus. They actually did have a ton of them in the 4 for $1 box, which I bought afterwards and then wondered why the hell I was reading this misogynist guy. There's, even though I didn't really have a word for it at the time.
And his story from Spawn, which is Spawn number 10, is a beautiful
Cerberus.
love letter to creators' rights.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, that panel. There is a panel, and where it's the and was that Sims or was that Gaiman's issue? Where
that was Sims' issue.
That had the jail cell, where vaguely recognizable hands and feet, some of them clad in spandex, some of them shades of green or metallic, were poking out.
Some of them with 3 fingers and orange rock instead of 5. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Just not even trying to hide who he's referring to, but basically laying out
one particular character who had died, being referred to as he who came first. It's a wonderful love letter to, and especially given Sims' problematic history with
everyone,
politeness.
It was very well done.
It's very well done.
But basically, what that page did and what that issue did was it laid out the Magna Carta for Image, or at least it published the in comic book form what the whole point of Image was, and that was to get away from publishers who owned the work, even though it was the creators themselves who were putting these characters, giving these characters life. And so that's why I really loved Spawn, and I didn't realize what direction it would take me in, having really loved those issues, but it took me away from superhero comics for 20 years, because it was from there that I discovered all of these independent writers, and I discovered, even though it was going back to the main publishers, I discovered Vertigo, and a lot of the classic 80s stuff that was being put out by Comico and a couple of, so Bill Willingham, like I discovered his Elementals, after this.
How long did you stay with Spawn?
I bought it monthly. I think probably through issue maybe 15, and then at that point, I stopped buying superhero comics altogether, and anything that I saw as a superhero comic, and just 100% focused on indie stuff from the 80s that I was able to find, as well as Sandman.
Okay.
That was that, and the occasional trade and indie collection, things like that. But yeah, I mean, I was buying Spawn until I stopped buying superhero comics.
Okay. With Spawn, I can't claim that I had the first hand. It was sporadic. I certainly got issue 6. Because I just remember being really drunk, and for some reason I left it on the train and went back for it and almost didn't get off the train. I have these landmarks for some reason with some of these titles, but through filling stuff in, let me see how many I had. I want to say I probably got at least to number 30. and filling in back issues. And I didn't see the film in the movie theaters when it first came out. There was a Spawn feature film, but I was riveted to the HBO animated series. I really like that. When I did start collecting comics again, that was one series that I went back and got a few. And Shadowhawk was also there because you could find Shadowhawk for 25 cents everywhere. So let me. Oh, this is driving me crazy. What Spawn? 29. Yeah, 1 through 29 was what I had.
It's really interesting because for me, I think of Image coming on the scene, even though my active comic buying years was like maybe 5 at that age, and Image showed up halfway through, that if it wasn't for Image, I wouldn't have moved away. Well, I wouldn't have moved away from buying the superhero comics and whatnot. And some of that, I do have to say, going back to this thing that was thrown out earlier, part of the reason why I stopped was the frustration.
Yep.
Image was, for all the good that it did and for all the influence it had, it was a terrible publisher in terms of consistency. You would go month to month not knowing when not knowing if you'd ever see another issue of the series that you liked. You would get a crappy throwaway issue that was mostly splash pages and action that didn't further the story much at all. When it did come out, those things were frustrating. And when you were constantly putting out new number ones or, one-shot issues or special miniseries, when, for the love of God, go back to the main series and give me the next issue of that instead of putting out more crap that's vaguely related to it, it's frustrating. And, the variant covers...
And all of the creators apart from Larsen were guilty of that.
All of them. And McFarlane, like I said, McFarlane learned kind of early on that in order to make sure he didn't fall into that trap completely, he had to outsource. And eventually Liefeld did too, as did Jim Lee. But I think they stretched themselves thin too early and too quickly, and ended up putting out subpar products. Again, aside from the fact they were putting out beautiful books, they weren't putting out good comics. A lot of them were not putting out good comics. And, they did eventually find that groove. They hired on basically the equivalent of an editor-in-chief to kind of keep them in line. And they became more of a real business and a real publisher as opposed to just a bunch of guys who had really great ideas but were going to do their own thing.
To this day, the only intellectual property that Image Comics owns is the Image Eye logo.
Yeah.
That's the only property that Image Comics actually owns. Everything else is with the individual creators.
But it wasn't until maybe like the late 90s, which is kind of outside of the area that we're going to talk about. But it wasn't until the late 90s when they really started, Silvestri, and I think, I want to say probably Jim Lee as well, started encouraging.
Well, they were Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld were a little bit earlier than the rest. Silvestri, he tried to. It was really when they had properties like Witchblade and the Darkness.
Yeah. That was Top Cow.
That Top Cow really coalesced into something. Something a lot of people say about Image is I like what Image became.
Yes, that's exactly it.
That you find that very common, but I do think that there's a lot of stories like yours, that you were saying that Spawn allowed you to open your eyes to works that were outside of DC and Marvel. And I think
different genres.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of people that have that particular affinity for this early period. Even a shitty book showed you possibilities.
Yes.
Even a crap book like Brigade, and you can't get worse than like Brigade is like, oh my God. I mean, some of those books, man. Ooh,
it's posed. Nobody knew how to close their mouths. Everybody had their mouth open to the maximum wideness so that every word was a shout.
There's a Wolverine analog on every team.
Every team. With a bisected beehive. I don't know what else to describe, but when I say bisected beehive, that kind of weird
pockets.
Oh, pockets.
Pockets. Yeah.
Pockets and knives where no knives should be. Bullets.
And I know that Liefeld gets the big rap for this, but things that were going on in Cyberforce, I still can't describe what the hell Cyberforce is about. That they're have kinetics, but they're mutants, but they're not. I still don't know what the hell it's about.
Speaking of Wolverine
Yeah.
analogs right there, that Cyberforce probably had one of the most egregious, most exact versions.
In Ripclaw, yeah.
Ripclaw. But, everybody's kind of guilty of that, even DC with Timberwolf but Timberwolf, yeah, what anyway. But actually, speaking of, do you want to start talking about how the Big Two responded to this?
Sure.
Well, I mean, think about
This is when the Big Two go extreme.
Extreme. Everything's extreme. Well, I mean, if you think about, 1990, the start of the 90s, this is when the gimmicks really start rolling through, but also some really great characters were being given a spot, like Robin. Robin was getting his own book here. You had, like I said, the impact.
Jack Knight with Starman. I mean, a lot of this stuff is happening at the same time. Astro City, a little bit later in time, but.
Well, but Astro City started at Image, though.
Yeah.
Yeah. But on the DC side, I mean, you had what massive thing happened, obviously, in the early 90s was the death of Superman. And the other massive thing that happened was, of course, Nightfall, where Batman gets his back broken. But what came out of that was kind of Image-fied.
Yeah, there were a lot of elements to books from both Marvel and DC where they weren't taking the lead. They were looking at Image for the lead.
Yep.
Now, I've narrowed this down to 4 of the most egregious examples. Okay? One that I have to admit I have never read. We never really had the DC Savage Dragon or anything like that. But if you go to the core teams, because there's really not a lot of daylight between Cyberforce or Youngblood or Wildcats.
Yeah.
They're all over the top characters. I think there is some nuance to the backstory about the Cherubim and the Demonites with Wildcats, but you basically have X-Men-ish teams.
Yeah,
across the board.
Which makes sense, seeing this where these artists came from.
Yeah.
They came from X-Men books. They weren't very Justice League-y. They weren't very Avengers-y. They were definitely very X-Men-y.
As we said, Image is remarkably popular at this time. There's a brief period in the 90s where Image is actually the number 2 publisher over DC. I think it was the very beginning of 93 in terms of the numbers.
It was right before people got fed up with, the fact that books were being dropped and, pushed back or canceled, solicits.
It was at a point where there was enough output that the solicitation pages and previews were more than 2 or 3 pages. And if you want to have a fun experience, I don't have those old preview catalogs. Somebody someday should just go through them and see all of the books that Image solicited that never happened.
Mm-hmm.
I would love a cataloging of that because it's got to be in the hundreds. Liefeld alone solicited a Bionics, which was a $6 million Man and Bionic Woman, though he didn't really have the rights yet. There's so many things that Image planned to do that never happened.
Yeah.
But going back to what we were talking about, so Image is remarkably successful. The Big Two are taking some of their leads from this. The spawns of Spawn. I completely admit, this is a book that I have never read. It ran for 12 issues from February 1994 to January 1995. And this was a book from Marvel called Night Watch. Creative team, at least at the beginning, was Terry Cavanaugh on writing duties and Ron Lim on art. Seems to move into a succession of artists after that. You have a character that has a cape and a very Spawny kind of mask, and I don't even know what this book is about, but it's clearly Spawn.
Yeah. Well, also, wasn't it about this time that Spawn had a night version of Spawn? So you had medieval knight, so they had a suit of armor Spawn. Was I think one of the versions that had come out. Probably very close to when Angela was created.
Okay, so here I have Night Watch. Night Watch was Dr. Kevin Trench, who witnessed a costume man die battling some terrorist armed with invisibility-generating cloaking devices and unmasked the corpse to learn it was an older version of himself. That actually sounds kind of cool. Maybe we should read this. Freaking out, Trench stripped the costume from his body and fled to a deserted island, reasoning that if he just never wore the suit or went home, he wouldn't die. All right, now get stupid. Events conspired him to bring him back, as the criminal Alfredo stole one of the costume gloves after washing up on the island and being nursed to health by Trent. After Alfredo had been dealt with, Trent decided he couldn't avoid his destiny and decided to investigate the costume's origins. And then there's a very detailed explanation. It appears that this character first appeared in Web of Spider-Man number 97, but man, it's about as close to Spawn as you can get without being sued.
Well, and also one of the big things that makes Spawn is his cape, and one of Nightwatch's powers is having a cape that responds to his thoughts and moves on its own to attack foes, and also allows him to glide or fly in the air. So there you go.
Okay. All right. So the next series of the Spawn of Spawns is DC's new version of Manhunter, which came out coinciding with the 0 Hour crossover. And in this version of Manhunter, it's not Paul Kirk, it's not Mark Shaw, it is Chase Lawler.
Chase Lawler.
He was a musician who was summoned by the Wild Huntsman to save himself and his girlfriend from harm. He did not understand the commitment he was making to the Wild Huntsman and found himself compared to Hunt the Lonely. He tried to resist the urge by hunting villains with limited success. Yeah. And it's real close to Spawn. And
the color scheme, the eyes on the mask.
It's like if a dumb person or had like too much Visine in their eyes and they had to get a Spawn costume, I can see them grabbing either Nightwatch or Manhunter. Yeah. The 0 Hour book spawned some really good stuff. A very underrated book in Primal Force, and of course Starman, as we had mentioned. But some of the other Zero books were La Bamba, and this one was one of them. So if you want to investigate, you can find these books on the cheap. There we go, Nightwatch and Manhunter. Now we go over to the teams, and Marvel's contribution to this was a book called Forceworks. Now I think that's really interesting what Marvel and DC both did here, in that they basically went to, for the most part, pre-existing characters to fill out X-Men, non-X-Men teams. With Forceworks, it was basically an Iron Man spinoff. The conceit of Forceworks was that they were proactive, that they would go and take care of stuff before they became disasters. They would not just stop disasters, but they would prevent them. So it was a little different philosophy. So the team was initially composed of Iron Man, U.S. Agent, Spider-Woman, the Julia Carpenter version of Spider-Woman, Scarlet Witch, who was unrecognizable in her short hair, and Wonder Man.
And Sentry, apparently.
Well, Sentry comes in after Wonder Man dies in the first issue. But
which I know.
Comic book, he got better. There was an Iron Man cartoon in 1994, which basically was a Forceworks cartoon, and the stories there are better than what we get in the comics. And then, as you go on, there is a crossover that just tied in, an Avengers crossover called The Crossing. And all the characters that you're used to are gone in a split second, and there's this other team. Oh, and you can't, just like the rest of the Crossing, you cannot make heads or tails of it. It's whoa. Moonraker, Cybermancer are some of the teams. I don't think these characters have ever appeared again in that later version of Forceworks. And if you're trying to find the final issue of Forceworks number 18, it took me forever to find it. So
really?
Yeah, because how big could these print runs have been? Maybe 27,000 at that point. If you can find it, it's cheap, but good luck finding it.
But then again, why?
I have this kitschy fondness for this stuff because it doesn't approach the territory where it's so bad it's good, but it's so bad it's charming. This is one of the few times you'll ever hear me say this. I will prefer Marvel's Forceworks over the DC Comics version of the Image team. And that went to a Justice League title. And you ready for the title?
Sure.
You ready for it? You ready? Extreme Justice. Okay. So this was a Justice League offshoot, which featured Captain Atom, Blue Beetle, and Booster Gold, but they were like armored up now. A derivative character of a retcon 1940s African-American character named Amazing Man, or A-Man for short, and the former Superman villainess Maxima. Whoa.
I'm just sighing heavily.
Okay.
Sighs.
Now,
Ugh.
later on, they are augmented on the team. So, DC characters do you think would eventually join?
Oh, I don't know. Hit me. Surprise me.
The Wonder Twins. They also have Firestorm and Plastique are also there. Basically, the characters with Captain Atom as the born leader are dissatisfied with the League's association with the United Nations. Maybe they were Trumpsters. These characters form their own league based out of Mount Thunder, Colorado. Carol Ferris, know her? She became the administrator of the Mount Thunder facility. The characters in the book were actually never referred to as Extreme Justice. They considered themselves Justice League. So at this point, you have 3 different Justice League teams in action: Justice League America, Justice League Task Force, which at that point went from being a variable team to a team with a set membership, and this one. The book lasted 19 issues, 18 issues with a 0 issue, and that paved the way for Grant Morrison's JLA. So what it paved the way for, very, very happy about that. But, whoa, and just really substandard artists. I mean, just some of these names, I've never heard of these people since. So desperate to be Liefeld or Lee and just not having the chops to do it, and just inappropriate characters to operate within this conceit. So out of those 4 titles, did you read any of those, or do you now want to?
No, absolutely not. That was the thing. These were probably the most egregious ripoffs, and they would have been completely out of my line of sight by that point. By the time they came out, the Image books had already been out for about 2 years. The ones that they're ripping off very, very clearly. And at that point, I would have been more on the way out of reading superhero books altogether. In fact, later, I would say probably in 93 and first part of 94, the only superhero books that I was buying, other than a couple Images here and there, were actually DC. Mm-hmm. With, of course, still some of the X books, but, I had gotten so disillusioned with Marvel's constant flow of gimmicks and, special covers and bagged, carded, holographed, whatever special issues, that I just stopped buying them altogether. So I just gone to, I rediscovered Justice League International and Green Lantern and The Flash and a couple other books that, I was starting to read, and then, of course, kind of got rid of that whole thing. However, DC was putting out some other, I would say maybe not so much Rob Liefeld-esque books like these extreme examples here, but retooling some of their existing characters as well in some of their solo books, bringing other characters into prominence because of their extremeness, like their maximum violence. So you had Guy Gardner gets retooled into Warrior.
Right. Certainly Lobo's success.
Lobo making a cameo in every single book, whether he was warranted or not. But then you also had stuff like the Legion of Superheroes Legion spinoff, which started in the late 80s, but became so gritty and harsh and, mature in the early 90s once Image really was at its peak. So that you were constantly having, cameos from Lobo, but there was a lot of every issue somebody died.
And this is one I never thought about before, and this is a property that comes later into Image, but certainly the 1996 around reboot of Teen Titans, where it was much younger characters, there's definitely a Gen 13.
Oh yeah, well, Teen Titans. Yeah. If you remember Teen Titans when that came out in 90,
I'm holding my nose.
Oh yeah, when was that? Like 92, 93? Well, they started off with multiple number ones, so like every number one was slightly different because it had a different cover with a different.
Well, it had a different backup story.
Exactly, it was the origin story of whoever was on the cover. So you had Terra, you had I think WildC.A.T.S was one of them. You had a couple other ones. I know I have a couple somewhere. I mean, Teen Titans was very much like that.
Yeah.
Here's a cool younger team using these
the
same
90s
characters.
were a very confused time for the Titans franchise.
Everybody
Whoa.
had really curly hair or really poofy hair and really poofy costumes with extra pouches and pockets.
Yeah, it took them a while to get things back on track.
It did. Yeah.
And some of it was even with Wolfman writing it, which is amazing.
Yeah. Well, and then also DC put out in '93, and I have to admit that I tried to read some of these not too long ago. Pulled out some of my old comics and tried to flip through them. They were awful. The Bloodlines crossover. It was an annual crossover that occurred in '93, I want to say it was, where they tried to introduce a whole bunch of new characters into the DC universe that kind of followed up with that more mature, more extreme, more dark, gritty style of character. And the only one that stuck was Hitman. And Hitman, of course, went on to become, an interesting niche book that a lot of people have very fond memories of.
Yeah.
But at the time, I mean, he was just one of many other characters that just disappeared as quickly as they came on the scene because nobody really cared. Bloodwind, don't forget about Bloodwind.
I won't forget about Bloodwind. Which was John Jones, and then it wasn't.
Yeah, when they kind of like retconned and then changed their mind.
Yeah.
But Bloodwind was also kind of Spawny a little bit.
Little bit. African American with a red, white, and black colors.
With a cape that kind of did its own thing.
There's a couple things there. But just tying this back to Image, what we eventually see with Image was the separation of the original 6 creators. The most, I would say, not controversial, but I would say the most extreme disconnection was with Liefeld. Yep. And then Jim Lee surprised everybody by selling his Wildstorm Studios to DC. He sold that at the right time because that also coincided with what people in the industry called Black September, which was September of 1997. Was it 97 where just a ridiculous number of comic book stores closed because the number of readers weren't there to sustain the stores as they were. Yeah.
I think Jim Lee was definitely in talks probably, I would say maybe as early as 98, but it was 99. I think
well, they also say, like, Marc Silvestri's been looking to sell Top Cow since day one.
Oh, yeah. Well, and he had actually pulled out of Image for a hot minute. I think it was some kind of dispute probably around Liefeld or whatever, but he had pulled out his publishing agreement with Top Cow and became truly independent and then came back into the fold at some point. But it's really interesting what happened in a very, very short period of time. I mean, we're talking about, from the first books that are being published in 92 through, maybe late 90s. It's really a period of 5 to 6 years that so much is happening.
The industry changed. Yeah. Retracted. Marvel's woes have been fairly well documented during that time. But we did have that little gem of time where anything was possible.
And I'd say between 92 and maybe 95, 96, everything was thrown at that wall.
Right.
Between Marvel and DC and Image, of course.
Even if Image really sucked, there was an excitement about it.
Yeah.
And most of it sucked. But there was this excitement of discovery. You didn't know who the next big creator would be. It was very likely that an independent would take that big creator as just as much as a DC or Marvel. And you also see a lot of fly-by-night. You see both in terms of writer and artist, these are names that have just disappeared. You do get that when there's an industry explodes. You do get grifters, people who didn't necessarily have a love for the medium, were getting into it for the wrong reasons. And certainly from a business perspective, you see that, especially with some of the other imprints that were happening around that time. But that's a story for another time. But I'm glad we got this chance to talk about. And just to let people know, initially we were going to talk about guilty pleasures, and it all tied back to Image. In a sense, we were talking about that. So we figured, if we're not going to get a regular episode out to you folks, let's drill down into something that we want to talk about and might have a little bit of fun, and we certainly hope that you had fun listening to this. So
Yeah.
we're going to wrap this episode up, and when we wrap an episode of the Comic Book Bears podcast up, it is with a segment which we call the Wolves of the Week segment, where we spotlight something, be it a comic book possibly, or maybe a film or a television show, or a charitable initiative. I always got to say charitable initiative. Anything under the sun that we think you, fair listener, may be interested in examining. So, Steve, what is your Wolf of the Week?
Well, my Wolf of the Week is not going to surprise anybody, but it is television related, and that is for Black Lightning on the CW. I saw the pilot of it, and
it's on right now for people.
It's on. It is on right now as we're As
this is how much we love you. We're missing Black Lightning, so
I'm missing Black Lightning. I have to say, I have not been impressed with a pilot episode for a new series, a new superhero series, as much as I have been with Black Lightning. I loved how unique it felt. And it, the showrunner is, of course, a little bit different. It's not Greg Berlanti like he is for all the other CW shows, but it's Salim Akil. And you can definitely tell that this, the showrunner, this writing group, and I've read several articles about it, some from people who didn't really like it, but some who definitely did because of what it represents. And it is an African-American run and headed and scripted superhero show. And I would say not unlike Luke Cage, but I think in this case, because it's on a national television channel, airing opposite and airing next to or as part of a bunch of other superhero shows that are, yes, they have diverse casts, but they are primarily very white. Black Lightning is a huge breath of fresh air. The characters are great. The actors are great. There's been so many great little Easter eggs for those of you who have read Black Lightning in the past or are familiar with the character that also connect him to the greater DC universe. And I have to say, Cress Williams, I am impressed with him. I love the suit. Whoever designed the suit is great. But I'm really excited by the women who are playing his daughters. China McClain and Nafessa Williams are basically his daughters who will eventually become, spoilers everybody, Thunder and Lightning. And it's just great to see them in this have as much of a central part of the stage as Black Lightning himself. So I'm really excited for this. I really recommend this for everyone. Maybe it isn't for you, but if you're looking for something a little bit different with your superhero shows or something that just expands upon what's available out there, Black Lightning, Tuesdays on the CW or anytime on the CW app or whatever.
And I have to agree completely. I thought it was a perfectly constructed pilot, very, very well cast, timely. Black Lightning. My Wolf of the Week is a television series as well, but a very different television series. I binged it this weekend. Very glad I did. The 4th season of Grace and Frankie on Netflix. It's a comedy series starring Jane Fonda and Lily Tomlin. For the basic premise of the show, they were formerly married to these two men played by Sam Waterston and Martin Sheen, who left Grace and Frankie for each other. So there is an LGBT element to the show. Sometimes when you get these shows where you have septuagenarian leads, there's a tameness about it. You don't get this at all. The F word is all over the map. It's kept a consistent tone and consistent quality over the 4 years. And to link you to the podcast world, one of the daughters of Grace is played by June Diane Raphael, who is one of the co-hosts of the movie discussion podcast, How Did This Get Made? So there's a link to the podcast world. So that's my Wolf of the Week, the 4th season of Grace and Frankie. So thank you for listening. Again, we are the Comic Book Bears podcast. You can find us on the Twitter and the Tumblr and the Instagram as Comic Book Bears. You can find us on the Facebook as Comic Book Bears Podcast. If you want to listen to us, you can do so by downloading us through iTunes or listening to us through Stitcher Radio. And if you want to reach out to us, please do so by sending an email to comicbookbears@gmail.com. Until next time, I'm Billy Z.
I'm Steve Morey.
You're going to hear a woof and an explosion. We'll be back real soon. Take care, everyone. Woof!